How does kapara work? How is it possible to atone for an avera? If you're in the same realm that is damaged by the avera, how do you have the resources to fix it? And if it's true, as we are taught, that it's a higher dimension which is untainted by our averas that allows the atonement to happen, well, if it's higher than our reality and higher than our averas, how does it help our averas? Let's look at how the Alter Rebbe explains both the nature of the letters of Hashem's name and how those letters are affected or impacted by our behavior, the Rebbe's father's insight onto this, and then we'll see this paradoxical reality of how kapara happens. In Ferten Perek von Igeres HaTeshuvah, the fourth chapter of Igeres HaTeshuvah, is the Alter Rebbe Mevoreh. The Alter Rebbe explains, V'azoi kol ha'yitzvos nichlolois v'nirmozes b'shem Havaya Baruch Hu. The Alter Rebbe explains that all 10 spheres are included in and alluded to in the letters of Hashem's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei. Those are important words, included in and alluded to. And then explains, Ki Yud, which is a tiny letter, which is just like a dot, that hints at the level of Hashem's Chochmah. And then he tells us, al hayud, the little flick, the little crown that is on or the little edge that is on the yud, the little, so to speak, hook of the yud, that is roy meiz, that hints at the Hashem's supernal rotzen. If you've noticed now, there's the word miramezes and the word roimes. They sound the same, they're not the same, we'll see why. And then when that original seed of an idea, chokhmah, expands and evolves into something broader and more developed, that's that is included in and hinted at in the letter Hey. And then when that same expanded version of divine revelation is then evolved further and made to be, so to speak, lower and more tangible, that's that will be incorporated in and alluded to in the final letters of Hashem's name, Vav Kei. The Alter Rebbe goes on to explain, how is there this continuum, how is there this bringing down of divine energy into a realm that is more accessible to us? It's through Hashem's midos, which are all incorporated in the symbolism of the number 6, which is the Vav, the letter Vav of Hashem's name. And then after having gone through the 6 midos, then the final manifestation of divine energy in its, so to speak, lowest or most tangible form is in Malchus, and that is incorporated in and hinted at in the letter, the final Hey of Hashem's name. So it's a description of how Yud Kei Vav Kei encompasses the whole process of Hishtalshlus. Stellt sich der Tate in seiner Oresef Tanya. So Rabbi in his commentary on Tanya says, he focuses auf 3 Shinuyim in the Lashon von Alter Rebbe beim Bezeichnen die Sheichos von die Oises Hashem zu die Spheres. He notes immediately that there are 3 different expressions that the Alter Rebbe uses when he's describing how these various letters of Hashem's name are associated with these different manifestations and evolutions of divine energy. When he talks about the so-called hook or flick, that little tiny piece of the extra piece of the yud, he says that hints at, and the word that he uses for hint is roimes, not merames. We'll see soon what the difference is. On by yud, whereas when he talks about the actual letter yud itself, which represents chokhmah, not keser, then nakat meramezes veloy roimezes. Then the Alter Rebbe changes the form of the word, and instead of using roimezes, which would be the feminine version of roimes for chokhmah, which is a feminine word, instead he uses miramezes. We have to understand why that distinction. And then by the zwei yud v'koit shala yud sagt beseder as es eine merames und roimes ev chokhmah v'keser rotzen. So when he's talking about the yud and the koitz on the yud, then he goes in the order in which they appear, which is that the yud represents chokhmah and the koitz is the next higher level, which is keser. Neat as chokhmah ve'keser merumazim b'yud ve'koitz. But look how he says it. He doesn't say chokhmah and keser are alluded to in the yud and its koitz. He says the other way around, that chokhmah is alluded to by the yud and then the keser in the koitz. But Rabbi points out that when he speaks about Bina and then of Midas and then Malchus, he actually orders it the other way around. As a Zayin Nirmozim, where he says, Hey, Vav, Hey, Deshem. There he goes in the order that the letters appear. As a Zayin Unitas, he says, Hey, Vav, Hey, Meramesim, Roim, Zim, Lahem. Rather than saying the letters allude to these things, he says these things are alluded to in the letters. See the distinction over here? So with Chochmah and Keser, he's saying the letter alludes to Chochmah and Keser, right? Chochmah and Keser, Merumazim. First he tells us what the thing is, And then he tells us how it is represented. And when it comes to the oisius hevav hey, is meramzim and meramzim, that alludes to the letters. Sorry, not to the letters, to the concepts, to the bina, the midas and malchus. Okay, right now it seems like a very subtle distinction. Another distinction that Reb Leivik points out between when the Alter Rebbe is talking about Chochmah and Keser on the one hand, or Bina, Midos and Malchus on the other hand, by Bina, Malchus nutzt nit no de Loshen Hermeses, no ich Loshen Klal Nichleles. When the Alter Rebbe describes how the letter represents Bina or Midos or Malchus, not only does he say the letter alludes to or hints at those levels, but he also says it's Nichleles. It is also incorporated within the letters as well. Whereas when it comes to the expression about Chochmah and Keser, he doesn't use the word klal at all, and it's nodem loshen remez meramezes remez. He only uses the words that it hints at. So we've got to understand what's the difference between when the letter hints at a particular topic or energy, or whether it incorporates that particular energy. In seiner Ora Anal is the Tate nit mevor the Tam of Tishnoi Manal. Now Reb Leivik doesn't explain why they are these distinctions, just points our attention to them. He just says, pay attention to the language, and almost saying you'll work it out. So it seems like Rabbi Leivik is saying, if I draw your attention to these anomalies in the text, it will get you to the point that you'll explore them and you'll understand. I don't have to explain it to you, which obviously the Rebbe is going to do for us, will explain to us. So based on how Reb Leivik has drawn our attention to the anomalies in the text, we see that there are really three elements or three stages that happen. The koitz al hayud is blois roimes the b'chinas ratzon elyon. You have the hook or the koitz, the so-called barb of the yud, that only hints at Hashem's ratzon. The nekuda von ois yud is meramezes l'chachmas yisborach, whereas the actual yud itself, which is this tiny little spot letter, that hints at meramezes, different word, to Hashem's Chochmah. And in the oises hevav hev nichloles v'nirmazes this spheres bin azal malchus, whereas the other three letters not only hint at but also incorporate within them the energy of bina and midos and malchus. But you have to remember that the introduction the Alter Rebbe used to the entire conversation was to say that all 10 spheres are not only hinted at but also incorporated within the letters. Is mashmaz oichef chochma was is von the yud spheres. That implies that chochma, although it's a very elevated sphere, is still one of the 10 spheres. Zogt men bechlolos as nit nor is der ois yud merames sefer nor oich as nichleles v'nirmezes in dem ois yud von Shem Havaya. Somehow the letter Yud is not only going to allude to Chochmah, but it will somehow incorporate the energy of Chochmah within it. So we've really got to understand what this concept is. What's the difference between a letter that alludes to an energy or a letter that incorporates an energy? And of course the big outlier will be Keser. But when we're talking about Hashem's Ratzon, which is the element of Keser, which is completely beyond the system of the 10 spheres, you cannot use the expression that it is incorporated in, although it is hinted at, and even then it's a different kind of hinting in the Koitz Shel Yud. Let's put it into different words. As it is first as Chochmah, we immediately identify that Chochmah has two components to it. On the one hand, Chochmah is one of the 10 spheres. It has a common denominator with the other spheres, and because of that, because it is similar to the other spheres, therefore it has a similar set of attributes to the other spheres, being that it could be incorporated in the letter that represents it, in this case the Yud. That's on the one hand. Based on the other hand, das was is hecher fundi under spheres. On the other hand, Chochmah is in a class of its own as spheres go. And in certain respects, Chochmah is actually more similar to Ratzon than it is to the other spheres, and therefore was der Fall. That's why he doesn't, when spelling out the details, use the word nichleles, that Chochmah is incorporated inside the letter Yud. And also here's that little subtlety again. It's not that Chochmah is hinted at in the Yud, it's rather that Yud hints at the Chochmah. Now we'll explain what the difference is between something being hinted at in the letter versus the letter hinting at it. It does sound like semantics, but there's a really significant difference. So the Bir and the other Diyukim, let's explain all of these points that Rabbi has drawn our attention to. And the Sheikhs and Igeres zum Teichen Klali was Retzich do in Igeres HaTeshuvah. Plus, we have to ask a broader question, which is, why is this relevant in the section of Igeres HaTeshuvah? Surely this sounds like something which should be maybe in Shara Yichud V'Emunah, where we speak about these technical Kabbalistic concepts. And obviously the Rabbi is drawing our attention to this because these specific anomalies in the text, they are relevant to the discussion in Igeres HaTeshuvah. We have to look at another question which needs to be addressed over here, which is a broader question, and that is as follows. What's the Alter Rebbe's objective here? He wants to explain here at this particular point, the Alter Rebbe wants us to know how Yud Kei Vav Kei will represent and hint within it all of the spectrum of the 10 spheres. And was is negert zu sagen, so the question is, if the objective over here is to talk about the 10 spheres, why mention at all, even if it's in parentheses, as the koitz she'al hayud why then at all speak about keser / ratzon, which is represented by the koitz shel yud, which is outside of the 10 spheres? The Alter Rebbe's goal is to tell us how the 10 spheros are reflected in Yud Kei Vav Kei. Why even discuss something that's not part of and is fundamentally beyond the 10 spheres? The kasha is noch starker. What makes the question stronger is the birdo in die Daladois Shem Havaya Zagdome. Why is Alter Rebbe even talking about these 4 letters and how they relate to the to the different dimensions of the 10 spheres? It's only to get us to a certain point. Zum Bir ve'oich in nishmas adam chelek havaya amoy, because Alter Rebbe wants to get to the point where he's going to say that the same kind of thing is reflected in our neshamas, because we are a portion of Hashem. And therefore the Alter Rebbe wants us to know that just as there are 4 letters or 4 dimensions of the 10 spheres represented by the 4 letters of Hashem's name, so there's that kind of a 4-dimensional system within ourselves as well. So when the Alter Rebbe reaches the point that seems to be the objective of this parak, which is to explain how it reflects inside of ourselves, he doesn't relate it back to the koitz shel yud. So if he's not going to explain the relevance of the koitz shel yud or how it's represented in our own system, why explain it in the technical side of what the 4 letters of Hashem's name represent? The answer is this. The Alter Rebbe's focus over here on discussing how we are all a portion of Hashem, and specifically a portion of Shem Havaya, is it's because the Alter Rebbe wants us to understand that when Chas Shalom a person does an Aveira, it causes some kind of blight, some kind of damage, some kind of tainting to the letters of Hashem's name. And then what's relevant to us is how we fix it. So how do we fix it? When we do tshuva, we access the 13 attributes of Hashem's rachamim, mercy, which is something that stems from Hashem's ratzon, something which is far greater than the energy flow which can be generated by the 4 letters of Hashem's name. And this incredibly powerful energy that stems from the Yud Gimel Midas Rachmim has the capacity to cleanse and to remove all of the blemishes that we have caused in the 4 letters of Hashem's name. Then we have a question. The Alter Rebbe is telling us over here, based on the pasuk that says that we are a portion of Hashem. He explains that we're a portion not just of Hashem generically, but specifically a portion of the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. As great as it is for us to be a portion of Hashem, if we're a portion of Yud Kei Vav Kei, how do we reach beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei to access this Yud Gimel Midas Rachamim, which is so powerful, this Ratzon, to be able to cleanse our Averos? That's a big question. How can we reach beyond ourselves? Typically, a person would never have the power to be able to attain something that is beyond where they come from. That's what the Alter Rebbe wants to immediately tackle as soon as he raises the point the first time. He needs us to know that Ratzon HaElyon, even though it is so great and so exponential, still has a link back to the 4 letters of Hashem's name. But not the actual letters themselves, but rather this koitz, this little barb on the letter Yud. Wie bald das Chelek Havaya Am ist verstanden. Also in können Zukunft durch Teshuvah euch zum Keitshal Yud. So now by telling us that there's this hyperlink between Yud Kei Vav Kei and Ratzon HaElyon, which is really beyond Yud Kei Vav Kei, and that hyperlink is in the Keitshal Yud, well then we have something we can work with, because if we are Chelek Havaya Am, if we're part of the Eibishter, part of Yud Kei Vav Kei, and Yud Kei Vav Kei has access to the Keitshal Yud, which is the Maila Maila, so at least we have access to that too. Let's understand this a little better. This concept that Hashem's Ratzon is what cleanses us from our Averis, because that's the real question. How does atonement happen? So now that we have identified that Hashem's will and supernal will to atone for us is linked to the Keitshal Yud, that helps us to start to understand how Hashem's Ratzon, which is fundamentally beyond the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei, which effectively means that whatever goes on in the world of the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei is technically irrelevant to Ratzon HaElyon because it's so removed and so beyond. And yet at the same time, that Ratzon HaElyon can seep in and reach in and have an effect and cleanse what's been damaged in the Oisis Yud Kei Vav Kei. Because logically it doesn't seem to make sense. The fact that Ratzon HaElyon is capable of providing the possibility of forgiveness, that makes sense. Because this is, Ratzon HaElyon is a dimension of godliness that hasn't yet taken on a particular form. It's not bound by certain restrictions or rules, etc. So there's nothing that can limit or impact or in any way restrict the power of this element of godliness. And so if we do things that are bad things, it actually makes no difference. So if that's a level which is so removed from our reality that our worst misbehaviors can't have any impact and can't make any damage over there, then obviously that allows Hashem the opportunity, so to speak, to forgive us from that perspective, because he was at that level never bothered by our affairs. Okay, fine. So he can be meichel. But that's not what we're looking for. How is it possible that this really, really elevated level, which is completely beyond the entire reality of Yud Kei Vav Kei, this mushlof and sir oisius, this is a dimension that is antithetical to what letters represent. Letters represent shaped energy, defined energy, finite energy. This is Ratzon, which is not bound by any of those things. So how could this supreme level actually take, so to speak, the attention and time and effort to cleanse a limited world? Yes, of course it's Yud Kei Vav Kei, it's letters of Hashem's name, but it's tzira, it's where things are in a bounded sense. So how can an unbounded energy fix the bounded reality of Yud Kei Vav Kei? That's what the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us. As the Ratzon HaElyon is verbunden mit Keitz Shel Yud, that the Ratzon HaElyon has a hook, it has a connection. The Keitz, which is part of the letter Yud, although it's not technically the letter, is the access point of this very, very deep, powerful, profound energy to be able to affect the Yud. Das heißt, das Ratzon HaElyon is not a gamer mushel von die Oisis Havaya. In other words, it's telling us that yes, you would expect that Ratzon HaElyon is something which can never, under any circumstances, be related to or incorporated in the Oisis, the letters of Shem Havaya and what they represent, and yet there is actually an access point. As the Aschala v'Shorish Makom von die Oisis. It's the first kind of little ink blot that everything develops out of. Punkt für Pashas, beim Schreiben dem Shem Havaya hört man an mit dem Keitshal Yud. That's how you start a Yud, right? You start drawing the Yud from that little point, and then you develop the Yud. On that far is a malady begomim in the Oisis, and that's why the Alter Rebbe is telling us something which is fascinating, that despite its so-called aloofness and abstractness and supreme greatness, the level of Ratzon HaElyon actually does have a touch point with the reality that we're living in, or the reality that we can affect through our behavior. This will explain something which emerges later in Igeres HaTeshuvah. Later on, the Alter Rebbe is going to explain to us how Ratzon HaElyon cleanses all of the blemishes that we cause through our Averis. He repeats the same principle because it's going to be relevant again over there. As Ratzon HaElyon Baruch Hu is nirmez b'koitze shel Yud. He explains to us that Hashem's Ratzon is dafka represented in the Koitza Shel Yud. Meiratzon ha'elyon baruch hu nirmas b'Koitza Shel Yud shel Ma'alim Yeshem Havaya v'Alochem lakim kol ha'begomim chulei. He explains that the atonement or the cleansing comes from that level of Ratzon which is completely unaffected and beyond the reach of our Averis, and therefore can cleanse us. De l'cha'era tomua. If you think about it, it's actually strange. This doesn't seem really that the most important place for us to know that Ratzon ha'elyon links to or is represented by the Koitz Shel Yud. Surely the Alter Rebbe, if you read what he's saying in context, wants to actually illustrate to us how removed Ratzon ha'elyon is from Yud Kei Vav Kei. Why then bring where it is represented? Right? The goal of the Alter Rebbe is to say Ratzon ha'elyon is completely beyond anything represented by the letters of Shem Havaya, and then in the same breath saying, and it's represented by the Koitz Shel Yud. Doesn't seem to make sense until you realize the context. It's the paradox that the Alter Rebbe needs to explain to us. In order for Ratzon ha'elyon to have a meaningful impact on the Oises Shem Havaya, on the parts of Shem Havaya that have been blemished by our behavior, you've got to have this paradox. Es muss sein von einem Ort, was es rührt, nicht wo es rührt, nicht an die Begabung von Chatoim. On the one hand, to be able to be immune to the effects of what Averis have done, because otherwise how can you fix them? So there's got to be this element which is completely beyond what the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei represent. But there's got to be some kind of a link. There cannot be a complete divorce. So therefore there's got to be the Koitz Shel Yud, which alludes to the fact that says, this is something beyond the system and yet linked to and can affect and cleanse the system. The only thing is, this actually raises a question in the other direction, because the fact that our Averis can cause damage to the letters of the Eibishter's name, and the only way to fix that is we've got to reach into an energy that is beyond the energy manifested in those letters Yud Kei Vav Kei. So let's understand, how can we have an impact on divine energy? Must be because this divine energy has already taken on a finite position. So it's got a tzir, has a particular way that it manifests, a particular way that it expresses itself. And the moment something has a finite reality and definition, it is susceptible to our impact. And by the way, the letter, the shape and appearance of the letter is an illustration of what kind of energy is represented by and embedded in that letter. So the moment something is in the realm of the finite, we're also in the realm of the finite. We may be way down the spectrum, but we're in the same realm. And anything that operates or lives in the same realm can interact and can affect each other. So if these are energies that Hashem has now crafted and shaped into a particular format, and we live in a particular format, our format might be able to ruin that format, so we can blemish that energy or those letters. Which raises a question. If we're now saying that there is part of that system of the letters, the Koitz Shel Yud, which also represents and incorporates Ratzon, not only is it that there's a part of the letter that represents Ratzon ha'elyon, but it's now that this Koitz Shel Yud, which is the Ratzon ha'elyon, is the beginning point of what will eventually evolve into all these various energies. That implies that Ratzon ha'elyon also has, if not an actual shape and form, at least the beginnings of the potential of shape and form. Which means that Ratzon ha'elyon is part of the beginning process of what will eventually lead to creations, including us. So that means that it is somehow related to the system, and we've said anything which is within the system has the ability to impact another part of the system. If Ratzon ha'elyon can touch our world to be able to fix our Averis, how come our Averis can't touch Ratzon ha'elyon to cause any damage? Let's look at it just in the actual four letters themselves. The letter Yud is the least formatted of all the letters. It's the most basic, the simplest, the tiniest of all of the letters. Was das weiß, as is bittul to illustrate to us that what Yud is and what it represents, Chochmah, is all about lack of identity and complete surrender to something which is greater than itself. Und von deswegen, wie bald es fort mit von an Osa, mit von Bittel, hat ehrlich Kisha bei Yudatzir. But nevertheless, despite the fact that Chochmah has this tremendous capacity for surrender to Hashem and transparency and invisibility, yet it is still a letter. That's the fact. The Yud is a letter. That implies that it still has a defined reality. Could be that its defined reality, its character is Bittul, surrender. But that's still character. It can be defined. And therefore it has shape, and therefore it has a relationship to our very solid and rigidly defined reality. And that's why Chochmah can even be affected, no matter how lofty it is, by our Averis. Surely the same thing should apply to the Kochel Yud. Yes, it's even less formed and therefore less rigid and less, so to speak, defined than the letter Yud. But the fact is, it still exists, right? You can see it. You can actually see the ink that was used for the Kochel Yud. Surely the logic then is that the energy represented by this koitz, which is Hashem's supernal ratzon, is still somehow, even if it's very distant and remote, but it's somehow linked to the world of things that are shaped and defined and rigid, and is not something which completely rejects the possibility of very finite beings who could even rebel and do bad things and cause damage. So how is it immune? In Emerson, is this the truth is that in a broader sense we could actually ask the same question about Yud, which represents Chochmah. Is because whatever damage an Aveira might do to the Yud Chochmah dimension of Hashem's name, the Alter Rebbe explains that there are two dimensions to Chochmah. There's the kernel of Chochmah, which is effectively like the intellect that a person has before it's actually developed into an idea. And then the moment when you get the idea, that's already a spashtos. That's already something which expands out of the core of the intellect within the person. So the Alter Rebbe talks about the possibility of the Chochmah, the actual pristine version of Chochmah itself, and then the mispashet, the bechina mispashetes mimena, like the so to speak radiance of the Chochmah outwards in the under spheres, which then has an impact on the other spheres. And it's actually that part of Chochmah which is susceptible to our damage, whereas pristine Chochmah is kind of protected from our damage because it's absolute bittul and it cannot be affected by the things that we do because we're metzias and that's bittul and the one doesn't affect the other. Let's explain it better. As we've explained, the entire real definition of Chochmah is absolute bittul. That's why it's this tiny little letter which is really just a dot. Is in Yemer Echad Ha'emes Shulevade Huvahin Zelosei. Because of that absolute bittul, Chochmah is the place, as the Alter Rebbe says, Zoyu Midas HaChochmah. What is the definition of Chochmah? This is the place where you feel and you can sense the absolute oneness of Hashem in the most absolute way that nothing else could exist. So when you're living with that reality that there's only Hashem and nothing else exists, you're not really susceptible to the pain or the blemish of Averis. So Chochmah is really immune to our Averis. But as we have already described, yes, Chochmah has absolute bittul, but that is its character, that is its definition, something which can be described and can be discussed. Because the minute you have something which can be defined, that could evolve into something which is even more defined, which could eventually evolve into something which is solidly defined as I, sense of ego, and the in the bechina mispashetes mimena. So the minute that beginning of radiating Chochmah out to give life to other spheres starts, it's now automatically susceptible to being damaged by our Averis. So isn't it verstandig? Same question about Chochmah that we had about Ratzon. What is the representation of the letter Yud? Not only the part of Chochmah that is supposed to be joined to the other spheres and to give them life, but actually the pristine core of what Chochmah is about. That's also represented in the letter Yud. Then surely everything about Chochmah should have some kind of definition, some kind of representation, some kind of finite boundaries. And anything which has boundaries cannot totally reject the possibility of beings that have boundaries. So how come it is that there's no real impact of our Averis on the level of Chochmah? Why not? How is it so immune? What's protecting it? It is, so to speak, linked to our reality. To answer all of those questions, that's what the Alter Rebbe wants us to know in his very nuanced language choices with regards to Keser, Chochmah, and the other spheres. That's what the Rebbe Levi is drawing our attention to. The spherois that are represented by the letters of Hashem's name do so in completely different ways. The spheres Bina Zo Malchus, when we're talking about the so-called lower spheres from Bina and down, in the Oisius of Hey. They are incorporated and not only alluded to, they're incorporated in those letters. Hey incorporates Bina. Vav incorporates the 6 midas. The final Hey incorporates Malchus. On the far Veiten they go for the Tzir V'Agbala von Yosef Mele Zayne Chatoim Pegim and they go for. That means they take on, so to speak, the shape of the particular letter that represents them, and therefore they are defined. Anything which is defined is susceptible to the impact of other defined beings. So our Averos can have impact and cause damage to the Hey, the Vav, the Hey, Bina, Zom, Malchus. Whereas Chochmah and Keser are not alluded to inside the letter. There's nothing about the shape of the letter and the design of the letter which actually incorporates Chochmah and Keser in them. It says, no, was the Yud v'kotzei zanirarem as oifsei. It's just that the Yud or the Kotz shel Yud is just like a symbol to indicate. But they're not actually represented by those letters. And that's why you can't really affect them, because they don't really have the tzir oisius. So let's just try and understand what that is. So let's say, for argument's sake, you would look at a hay. You look at a hay and you see the expanse. You can actually see it. You can physically see it. It's got width, it's got length, it's got depth, because you can even see the short leg of the hay as being three-dimensional and going into the depth of the paper. The Vav, you can see that it's all about drawing down. You're bringing something down. The Yud doesn't yet have a shape. So even though Yud represents Chochmah, you don't look at it and see Chochmah in it, and certainly not in the Kotz Shel Yud. It's kind of like the difference between companies that have a logo, where the logo represents the culture or the product that the company is all about, and other companies that just have an arbitrary logo. So when you look at the logo, you know that it represents that particular company, but there's nothing about the logo that tells you that. And then there's a further distinction between Chochmah and Ratzon, which is in Keser. The Alter Rebbe tells us that the Yud is miramezes. That's an active word. Miramezes, like mashpia, milamed. It implies that you're doing something really active to show this link and this representation of Chochmah. It's a heavier expression. It says merer in the remizah. It's not kind of an investment in I am representing, and I'm the Yud, I am representing Chochmah. If so that's alluding to the fact that Yud has a clearer link to Chochmah, that you can actually see it in the letter Yud. And you probably were thinking of that when mentioned that Hey is wide and Vav is long. You also think, but a Yud is exactly like Chochmah. It's like that spark. Well, that's the point. You can actually see some kind of a link and a connection. There is some kind of a link between the energy that Chochmah is and the letter representing it, Yud. And then, as we've said, because it takes on a particular shape and form, and therefore it's in the realm of the finite world, therefore it is susceptible, at least the part of Chochmah that is mispashetis, that has a link to the rest of the spheres, can be affected by our Averis. But when it comes to the Kotz Shel Yud, then he uses the word roimez, which is a very light word. It hints at it, alludes to it. It's like an arbitrary logo that represents a company. And it represents Hashem's supernal Ratzon. But there's absolutely no real link or similarity or representation of Hashem's Ratzon in a Kotz Shel Yud. On the far is in Ratzon, so because the Ratzon itself doesn't take on any shape or form, it's completely divorced from the reality of our finite world, and therefore it's not susceptible to the misbehaviors of our finite world. And that comes back to our point about the paradox of Ratzon. So, on the one hand, the Ratzon is linked to Kotz Shel Yud, which in turn is the hyperlink to allow Ratzon access to the whole Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is why it can make a difference in the world of Yud Kei Vav Kei and cleanse the blemishes that were attracted to the letters of Hashem's name through our bad behavior. Yet at the same time, it's very klal nit nitpas in dem koitz. But the koitz doesn't hold or represent Ratzon ha'elyon in a meaningful way, so therefore it doesn't ever enter into and become trapped in our reality. And therefore Ratzon ha'elyon is actually fundamentally beyond the entire system of Yud Kei Vav Kei. And therefore no Avera can do it any harm or blemish it in any way. And that's what obviously allows it the possibility to be able to cleanse. There's a nice example of this that we can see practically in the difference between the holiness of the garment of a talis versus the strings of the tzitzis. Talis gashmis hat nicht shum kedusha klal und mutar lishtamesh bo divrei chol ma'ashenkim betzitzis. The halacha is that once you've used the talis, if you remove the tzitzis strings from it, technically you could use it as anything else you want, a shawl, a blanket, whatever. Has no holiness, whereas the strings of the tzitzis are fundamentally holy. Is aber nicht pshat as the talis nicht can shaychas nicht zu der mitzvah. That doesn't mean to say, okay, so talis is no longer part of the mitzvah. Adarabba. The Arizal schreibt, is kedushas talis god l'maylos b'moed moed al kedushas tzitzis. The Arizal actually says that the extent of holiness associated with the garment of the talis is in a certain regard far greater than the holiness in the strings of the tzitzis. Which is why, according to Kabbalah, really the tzitzis is just like strands that are an extension of the talis. So how come then you can discard the talis afterwards? Now the Indian in them is, it's as follows. In the tzitzis was ein release nimin. The tzitzis are just strings, like almost like rays of light. Is da an orim was werden slabish in the tzitzis, representing the fact that the holiness which tzitzis conveys is a stream. It's a particular channel of holiness that is designed to live within the world. It's been limited, it's been focused, it's been fine-tuned to be able to live in the world. To, like that stream of the string. It's small, it's contained. And therefore the tzitzis are able to hold and retain the holiness that streams into them. Whereas talis, which is something we wrap ourselves in, representing that it is an energy that is greater than who we are, and we are enveloped by the energy rather than being able to capture the energy. So the energy, the holiness of the talis is not caught up in the actual fabric of the talis. It's just that because we're enveloped in a talis, that is a hint to the fact that we're enveloped by an infinite godly energy. But because that godliness cannot be held by the talis, so therefore the talis itself does not become holy. It's the same kind of principle. So the godliness that is manifested in Chochmah and certainly in Bina and Zohar Malchus, that's a godliness that can be contained. Whereas the godliness that is represented by Ratzon ha'elyon, by the Kodesh Shel Yud, that cannot be contained. It doesn't enter into the system, even though it channels tremendous holiness. And the Dugma now von Talis, so in this example that we've just used, the talis represents this incredible, very aloof kind of energy that is totally beyond anything that we could capture or tune. And it's so removed from the actual tangible experience of the talis that afterwards you could use, as we've learned, halachically use the talis for something else. So that's a talis. What would that represent in divine terms? So we've spoken about Yud Kei Vav Kei. That would be like the tzitzis. What is a talis? That would be the word anoichi, which we're told is the what's powerful about anoichi is it doesn't have a name. So it's not like Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is a name of Hashem, and certainly not Elokim. But not only that, it cannot be captured in any letters or even in the koitz, the edges of the letters. Was in einem Wort Anoichi is nicht talking Kedusha von Hashem, and yet on the other hand, Anoichi is not considered one of the holy names. You write Anoichi on a piece of paper, you could discard it. Anoichi is not remes. The word Anoichi is purely just a logo to represent or a hint at Hashem's absolute essence. I am who I am, which you cannot ever know. And so that is an energy of Hashem which is completely beyond being captured, held, experienced, felt, described. But it gives us an insight into those energies that can be experienced or described or felt. Aleph, in the Oisius. So first of all, we have the concept of an energy that can be actually captured in words. When you have a teacher explaining something which is very advanced intellect, so you can see the words that the teacher is using. The nature of those words conveys the content. You can actually feel the energy and the insight of the teacher's wisdom inside the words that the teacher is using. Bays, there was kanitnis slabish very noises, and then there's another degree of energy that is being conveyed that doesn't fit in the words. Says no was the all you can use is words to kind of hint at the fact that there's something greater. Like for example, a riddle, and chida is one of the words used for prophecy. So when people speak, so to speak, in tongues, where they're saying something, you don't really understand what they're saying because the message is far too profound to be captured in the words. When you pose a riddle, you're not just teaching a lecture, you're not sharing a concept, you're alluding to the fact that there's a concept that's beyond what anybody can understand, and therefore it's a riddle. It would be a real stretch to suggest, well, the wisdom is in the riddle. It's not. The riddle alludes to the fact that there is wisdom. Now you've got to find the wisdom. The words don't contain the wisdom. And that is alluded to in the two things that Anochi does not have, the two properties that Anochi doesn't have. On the one hand, etvas b'shem, that it's not represented by a name, and beis ramas beis v'koitz, it's not hinted at with any letter or even the koitz of a letter. Etvas b'shem, when we say that Anochi cannot be captured or described in a name, that's saying that means that other kinds of energy can be represented in words, in names, in descriptions, in teaching. And when that happens, then the energy takes on a particular form and it kind of gets locked into that form. So if I can explain it, that's now what that energy is. And even the letters of the particular words that I'm using to describe this particular energy, those letters will illustrate the nature and shape and form of that particular letter. Then there's beyond that. There's ramas bois for koitza, those things which can be hinted at with a letter or with the koitz on a letter. The shaykhs zwischen the bois for koitza mit the kinim is in them. Was in the tzir is the ramas sefanor. There's the words are not actually carrying the theme or the message. There's something about the letter that hints at this particular message. Oh, a yud is tiny, so it hints at the fact that chochma is bittul. Until the dogma. Then a code of Yud is a ramas even bit of Sferas HaChachma. And the koitz she'al hayud, and then you have the koitz on top of the yud. Was is not considered, which doesn't even look like a letter. No, blows a ramas bilbad. It's just a hint, a logo. Is a ramas of kes was nicht beged a saga klal and vetnis galan ob der ramas that alludes to something which cannot be described. It can only be hinted at, riddled at, so to speak, which is keser. Aber der Gufa wird in den Slabisch nicht was in dem Zirha ist verkeits, also as der Sheiches is not der Remes. What's important for us is that when you're dealing in the Remes category, then you're not capturing the energy in a word, you're only alluding to the fact that the energy exists by that word or probably letter or probably even just piece of a letter. Das sagt der Biren, die drei Chilukim von Keser, Ratzon Chochma und Bina Zom Malchus. And now with that in mind, we can see the clear distinction between Keser, one category, Chochma, the next category, and Bina and Midas and Malchus, the third category. In Keser, Zani Tokin Kalim. Keser doesn't have the possibility of boundaries, of Kalim, of definitions. Says Nitshaychas is on Islabish and it was very nan Inyan. I feel it in our koitz. Keser is just pure unbridled energy that cannot be held, cannot be shaped, cannot even be represented, even by a koitz. Says no, was the Keser Shuyud is a Rem Esefim canal. At best, the Keser Shuyud could hint at the fact that Keser exists. So Keser is just unbridled energy. In Chochma, Chochma, on the other hand, does have parameters, and it does have a way to define it. But Chassidus explains that the nature of the definitions, the kelim, the vessels, that which contains, defines, and represents Chochma, is not real keli. It's just finite or. So it's energy that has been shaped. Which is why we say that Chochma, even when it exists as an entity called Chochma, exists in a state of bittul, because the light shines right through. There's nothing to block it. And the Rabbi is Eichen Chochma nicht scheiß zu sagen, als sie wird nichel oder vernimmes in an Eisukli. And therefore it wouldn't be appropriate to say, certainly not that Chochma is held within or incorporated within a vessel, within a letter, because it can't be, and not even to say that it's hinted in the letter. Says no, was in the Kudas Hayud is Remes oifen bitul von Chochma. It's just that this letter, being so tiny, the Yud, is a great way to represent the energy of Chochmah, which is this complete submission and bittul. It is a letter, it's not a koitz, it's an actual letter, it's got shape, it's got dimensions. Aber sein Sira is nekuda levad bittul. What are its dimensions? What is its shape? Something which is absolutely diminished to show that it is a diminished energy. But to be clear, Chochmah does have its parameters, it does have its character of submission. Therefore, there is some link between the physical appearance of a yud and the energy of Chochmah that it represents. Was der Fall ist, der Yud nicht räumen, es mir doch nur mehr Messer Chochmah ist more mit der Zugetragenheit kann als sein. That's why the word that Alter Rebbe uses over here is, yes, it is a hint, but what kind of a hint? An active hint, an engaged, an invested hint, because the Yud actually does link us to what Chochmah is about. But when you get to the world of Bina, certainly Zoh and Malchus, now you're talking about energy that actually lives in those definitions that the Kelim represent, that the letters represent. This is their stomping ground, this is their extent of expression. And therefore, it's not only are they hinted at by these letters, but they're actually held within these letters. In the oisis hevav hey, ze werden slabish v'nitvas in the oisis bis ze werden v'atel fun ze nichloles. Over here, Hey contains in it the energy of Bina. Vav contains in it the energy of Zoh. The final Hey contains within it the energy of Malchus. But what's interesting is, the Alter Rebbe doesn't stop at the point and say, well, these energies are kind of, so to speak, sucked into and held in these particular shapes and forms and definitions. He also uses the word nirmezes, that they hint at. Why? Now, nicht wie bei Kesef Chochmah, the Oisius Hev of Heizan Rabbis, they say, that's a very nirmez in the Oisius. So he uses the word hinted at because obviously the letter isn't the energy, but he wants to say that it's nirmez in, that the letter has become incorporated, the energy has become incorporated inside the letter. So when you look at this letter, you can actually see a real representation of what this energy of either Bina or Zoh or Malchus is. As we've described, the energy becomes shaped by the particular letter. So what the letter looks like is a means of telling us what the energy is like. We do have to know that there's a distinction between the energy itself, which now takes on a shape, and what represents it, the keli, which also has a shape. In Oisis v'kelim, v'baldas in yonim is mitzias, is a tzir shebematel von zer mitzias gufa. The whole purpose of a letter is that it should exist, and it should exist in a unique, distinct way. You need to be able to tell the difference between an aleph and a beis. Therefore, the shape and form that it has is very key to its being. Aber der Eure, was mit Zadatzim is aposhut, says no, was is sich mislabish nakeli. But the energy within an aleph doesn't have that same, specific shape or that same specific set of finite borders. It's it's poshut, it's light. It's just reflecting or filtering through a particular form or a particular screen, as we'll see in a second. So right now, the energy of Bina is in the first Hey of Hashem's name, so it's kind of shaped by everything that a Hey represents, but it's not limited solely to what the Hey represents. It's a great example for mayim was gefinnen sich nach kaliertes kleis hochis. You pour water into a colored, into a green vase. As das, was mayim sehen sich wie gavon akli, ist das nicht entschieden in der mayim gufa. There's no question about that. I now see green water, but the water hasn't become green. So the filter affects our perception of the or. The keli limits the manifestation of the or, but it doesn't limit the or. And also, that's why the Alter Rebbe is not satisfied just to say that nichleles, the energy, has now been incorporated into this reality called Hey, but it's also nirmezes. The kelim of the spheres very nichlel in that sphere from the Yosef, the, so to speak, finite parameters of this particular energy called Bina are in fact held within the physical manifestation of a letter Hey. Whereas the energy of the sphere of Bina, the light, the energy, is a subman. Yes, it has now a shape, it has now a set of definitions that are similar to the physical manifestation of a Hey, but it's not bound by the Hey, it's only hinted at in the Hey. It's water in a colored vase. You'll see a similar thing in mitzvahs. because mitzvahs are linked to Yud Kei Vav Kei. On the one hand, you have the Ma'aseh mitzvahs, the actual practical doing of the mitzvah. Was an ongiton in Kelim, in Dvarim Gashmim. In order to do a mitzvah, you need certain tools, and they are physical, so they have finite dimensions and sizes, etc. Zayin Tluyim in the Kelim from the spheres. So the physical apparatus of the mitzvah and the physical actions of the mitzvah are related to the Kelim of the sphere that particular mitzvah engages with. Unkavonas mitzvahs, but the intention and meditation behind the mitzvahs, you don't need the physical item to really affect the intention that you have behind the mitzvah. That gives us access to the energy of the sphere associated with this particular mitzvah. And lastly, now we can go back and understand how come it is that when the Alter Rebbe introduces the entire conversation, even including a reference to Chachma, he does say not only Nermezes but also Nichleles. Why? It all depends what we're comparing Chachma to. So if we're comparing Chochmah to the level that produces all the spheres, was in ganz ein Hecher von the spheres, and therefore obviously is a dimension of godliness which is fundamentally beyond the spheres because it produces the spheres. In the other spheres, well then we're going to say, here's the producer of spheres, which obviously has no Oris, no Kelim in the classical sense, yet Chochmah does have Oris or Kelim, so Chochmah is actually more similar to the other spheres. We say, well, Chachma is similar to the other spheres in the sense that it's not only Nermezes, but it's Nichlolos, meaning to say that it has definitions. But if we're comparing Chachma to the other spheres, which is what the Alter Rebbe does next, seeing as even the parameters and definitions of Chachma are themselves light and energetic, then we no longer say Nichleles, because the truth is that the Chachma is not being held in or represented perfectly by the letter that represents it. And this is even more rich when you consider that Chachma itself has two levels. You have the pristine Chachma, we already touched on this a little bit earlier. There's the fact that there is intellect which is still at a stage that is beyond actual ideas. In other words, sure, the ideas are the tangible part of Seichel, but there's a dimension of the Seichel that exists that is not the sum of all of those ideas. It's Nela Mikol Rayan. It's intellect, which is hidden from actually being the producer of all the particular ideas. Was dan is a Hecha von Islavish Mitzvah Kesser. From that perspective, Chachma is completely beyond being held in any kind of a definition or any kind of representation similar to Kesser. And then then you have Chachma when the Chachma actually hits. You actually have the insight or the idea or the perspective. Was done is a Igeres Vishar Hayut spheres. At that moment, Chachma is behaving like the other spheres. It is manifesting. It is defined. It's a particular idea. Yes, of course, it's a very subtle idea, and that's why we lose Chachmas quite easily if we don't give them the attention. But it is nevertheless some kind of a definition. Und der Rebbe is the Rebbe. Pshas Alter Rebbe redt wegen the Yud spheres. Therefore, when the Alter Rebbe is talking about the 10 spheres, redt wegen Chachma, wie sie es Igeres Slapshus. He talks about Chachma as something which invests in the realities. Und der Fall sagt, so he's talking about spheres. Part of the spheres is Chachma. Part of what Chachma does is it manifests in tangible ideas that we can actually understand. So therefore it's nir mezes v'nechleles. It is actually incorporated in the so-called reality of the kelim that it represents. But when the Alter Rebbe speaks about Chachma as Chachma, not Chachma as a part of a system, Chachma in its most pristine, ideal form, and there the Alter Rebbe wants to show us that Chachma is just so concealed and beyond anything that we could capture or define, that in our experience would be considered the so-called hidden or invisible intellect. There the Alter Rebbe only says the Yud hints at Chachma. He doesn't say the Yud incorporates Chachma because it's an invisible Chachma at this point. It's a pristine Chachma. There isn't yet anything to be represented by a particular letter.